Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 11. Never the time and place, and the loved one all together. Robert Browning, Never the Time and the Place. Edward Lakin swallowed convulsively. "I don't understand it," he said. The black coach bearing the coffin had returned to Gallows Green. The couriers had gone back to their shops and farms, and Superintendent Hacking had been driven back to Colchester by the uniformed constable who had brought him. The 12 jurors were bellied up to the bar, drinking the convivial pints purchased for them by Harry Hodson, and explaining to anyone who would listen the complex logic behind their verdict. Edward and Charles were seated at a scratched deal table in the rear, a pitcher of local beer before them, a dark brew faintly suggestive of licorice and tobacco, and with a definite body. Edward, having had 2 glasses, was feeling deeply morose. "I don't understand it," he said again, staring into his glass. "The sheep stealing, you mean?" Charles asked. "Not that, nor the superintendent's giving the case over to Pell, nor—" He leaned back in his chair and bitterly mimicked the super's clipped tone. "The urgent attention of police in this neighborhood. If Hacking had bloody wanted the urgent attention of the police, he could have had my attention. I am the police in this neighborhood." Of all the hurtful things about this case, that had been the worst. To hear his superintendent, in the presence of every male member of the Dedham community, say that Artie had been working his patch trying to solve a crime that he had never heard of and had died in the process. And then to learn that the case was being taken over by C.C. Pell. Jesus, Mary and the angels, it was bad enough that Artie was dead. It was even worse to think that he'd been murdered because he was doing Edward's job. And worse yet, to have to wait for somebody else to find the murderer. Christ above. "You mean," Charles said, "you'd rather have gotten yourself killed than Artie." He picked up a pitcher as if to pour himself a second glass, but apparently decided against it and sat it down again. "At least I don't have a wife," Edward said. "Not a child. What's more," he added forcefully, "I don't for a minute believe that Artie was murdered in this neighborhood. I think he was killed on his own patch and dumped here. And whether he was on police business," he clamped down on the anger roiling inside of him. "I'm telling you, Charlie, if there's any sheep stealing going on here, I don't know anything about it. And neither does anybody else. You could see that on the faces of those jurors. If an animal goes missing here, everybody for 3 miles around knows it. Within the half hour, they're out counting their own flocks." He said each word emphatically. "There's been no sheep stealing hereabouts." "You think the superintendent is mistaken?" Edward made circles with his wet glass on the tabletop. "How the bloody hell should I know?" he asked wearily. "I'm just a country copper." He leaned back in his chair and stretched out his legs, examining the muddy toes of his boots. "Anyway, Hacking has given the case to Pell. I don't have to worry about it anymore, do I? Let Pell knock his head against it." "I wonder about that," Charles said thoughtfully. "The body was found in your district. Why would Hacking assign the investigation to somebody else, and especially to a chief constable?" "And especially to Chief Constable Pell," Edward said. He took another swallow to wash down the bitter taste in his mouth. "Pell's as woolly as a sheep himself." He gave a short, sarcastic laugh. "Got himself disabled in the line of duty. Bloody hero, but damn stupid. Since he wasn't of any use on the beat, they made him chief constable. 20 years behind the desk hasn't sharpened him up any. The only thing he knows how to do is deny promotions. Pell had been quick enough to deny his. He was still at the level of constable long after Artie had been promoted to sergeant." Charles lifted his eyebrows. "And that's the man Hacking has preferred to you." "That's him, damn it," Edward said wrathfully and slammed his glass on the table. "Well, let 'em have old Woolly Pell if they want him. But he'll never get to the bottom of this, I promise you. I wouldn't care, either, if it weren't Artie Oliver we're talking about." He shook his head, despairing. "That's the bloody hell of it, Charlie. Artie deserves justice done, and Agnes and that little girl deserves to see the murderer hanged. and I've been removed from the case, confound and curse it. Edward was not a sentimental man, but his heart softened when he thought of Agnes Oliver. Ah, Agnes. He loved her a dozen years ago, but somehow the time and the opportunity to let her know how he felt had never come together. And then suddenly the banns were being set for her and Artie, and all his hopes had died. A dozen years, but she was still beautiful. It was the first thing in his mind when he and Charlie took her the dreadful news. How beautiful she was, with that sad, silent dignity that tore at his heart. It couldn't matter now, of course, although he'd lain awake many nights in the intervening years, lonely and longing, wishing for Agnes beside him, and envying Artie with such a woman in his bed. But that had been then, and this was now, and 17 and 10 a year would pay the rent on the cottage, but leave nothing for food. At the bar, the jurors had drunk up Hodson's pint, and were into their own. If they kept on drinking for long, they'd do it on the tick, since most wouldn't have another shilling in their pockets until the end of the week. They were discussing the case loudly over the rusty wheeze of the concertina someone was playing outside the front door. Sanders, the publican, a tall, lanky man in slippers and trousers too short for his legs, was saying to a tenant farmer who had just lost his farm, "There's no good going again to Gentry, Jack. They got land and they got money, and what do you got?" He spoke with the authority of one who owned his own business, while the dispossessed farmer sadly hung his head and wiped his eyes on a grimy sleeve. "I wonder," Charles said slowly, "if I could be of some help in this matter." Edward gulped down the dregs of his beer and poured a third, the last in the pitcher. "God-awful beer," he muttered, slobbing it on the table. "Any more murders round here, old Harry ought to move to Inquest Marlborough, where the man can get something decent to drink afterwards." "I had it in mind, Ned," Charles remarked, his gaze steadily on Edward, "to look into Artie's murder myself." Edward leaned his head on his hand. His vision was blurry and his tongue felt thick. Sanders probably brewed his beer in the privy. "You did right well the last time you took into your mind into a murder, Charlie," he said, lapsing into a slurred country idiom. "Or even the doctor guessed what it was worth for Ardley's sisters." Charles was thoughtful. "I don't suppose you've seen Miss Ardley since she received her inheritance?" "Nah, contrary," Edward said, rubbing the back of his head. See her quite often." Charles looked up, startled. "The devil, you say?" Edward pursed his lips. If it had been anybody but Charlie, he would not have confided the truth. "Been teaching her to ride a bicycle," he said. Miss Ardley's request for the lessons had come as a surprise, but he had been glad to help. He understood and honored the wish for independence that lay behind her desire to ride a bicycle. So it was with pleasure that he had helped her obtain a suitable machine, and had devoted several delightful Sunday evenings to assisting her wobbly efforts. The friendly, casual intimacy of their excursions had proved a welcome break in the humdrum routine of the police work that was the center of his life. He grinned fondly. "Lovely sight that, I'll tell you, Charlie, my friend. Kate Atley on her cycle, weaving merrily down the lane from ditch to ditch, singing at the top of her lungs. Even rode into Mrs. Perry Black Cow one afternoon. But she stayed with it, bless her. Goes flying down High Street, proud as you please, basket piled with parcels. She's a wonder, she is." His grin faded slightly, and he fell into a silence. He was thinking of Agnes, beautiful Agnes, and how she might look on a cycle, her hair blowing in the wind, her face alight, flying beside him down the steep hill toward the river Ster. But she was a widow now with a child, and Artie's murder had broken her heart. What might have been was past, and would not come again, dream as he might. Edward's reverie was broken by the advent of the publican's fat wife with a tray of fragrant pies. "All out," she cried, over the enthusiastic babble that greeted her. "Beef, mutton, and eel, all out." Thinking that food might serve as an antidote to the beer, Edward signalled to the woman, received a penny halfpenny pie. The woman gave Charles a dimpled smile. "How about you, sir? Or eel pie, sir?" Charles shook his head and watched as Edward wolfed down his pie. After a moment he remarked, oddly and apropos of nothing that Edward could think of, "I suppose you consider taking a wife, Ned?" Still fuzzy-headed, Edward finished the last bit of pie. "I have." He thought of the time when he might have asked Agnes, but had not, delaying, believing that she had deserved more. But life's hard for a PC wife, and precious little to show for it. 22 shillings 11 pence when I began, and not much more now. Long dirty hours, difficulty, danger. A wife never knows when a man won't come home. He shook his head sadly. No station either, no respect. To most, a policeman as low as a criminal, and his wife none the better. But Agnes had wedded a policeman, and had lived with the duty hours and the danger, and had not wished for more. Edward sighed, weighed down by an awareness of the time and the opportunity he had missed, and feeling that life had somehow grown sadder as he had grown older, alone. He had taken a wrong turn when he might have asked Agnes to marry him, and had not, and he was heavy with regret. For his part, Charles, looking at his old friend, felt sympathy, and beneath that sympathy, sadness. He knew Ned to be a man with a large and warm heart, as well as intelligence, courage, and humour. He deserved an intelligent, courageous wife who would love him and laugh with him, whatever others might think. Charles did not know many such women. In fact, he knew but one, and therein lay his sadness. Her name was Kate, and Ned was teaching her to ride a bicycle.